Hey, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. So this past week, I just released a new single. It's got 3 songs on it, and it's also the first time I've ever released music with vocals. And I recorded and performed all the vocals on the record. And yeah, I just thought for today's video, it'd be kind of interesting to look through the Logic project for Thought Machine, which is the first song off the single. And yeah, pretty much just look at how I recorded everything, talk a little bit about, the production and how I mixed everything, and just go pretty in depth so you can kind of get a sense of, how I did everything and hopefully learn something as well. And if you haven't heard the single already, I'll put a link down in the description where you can have a listen. But without any further ado, let's jump into the project. All right, so yeah, here's the project. So right now it looks pretty clean and organized, but actually in its current state, it's a bit messy. I've just got a lot of stuff hidden. So what I'll usually do actually at the end of a project is I'll bounce pretty much everything down to audio and do a bounce in place. So what you see kind of in the end here is all these BIP tracks. Those are just kind of bounced to audio. So any plugins I was using for guitar tones or any MIDI I programmed and that sort of thing is all just kind of printed down to audio. And then, I'll do any mixing on that sort of audio file instead of the sort of DIs or the MIDI tracks that I may have. This is just good because I've had plugins and takes get corrupted in the past, and when you have it just as audio, it's always going to be safe going forward. So that's just the habit I've been trying to get into. But yeah, I think for the kind of rundown of the mix, I think we can start with drums, and then we're going to go into the guitars and bass. We'll take a look at the vocals, vocal production, and that sort of thing, and kind of wrap up with kind of the production elements and some layers and things I programmed and that sort of thing. But yeah, we can kind of jump right into the drums here. So we can just have a quick listen to what they sound like soloed here first, and then I'll talk a bit more about them. Yeah, so I used for the actual drum sounds, I used Modern and Massive 2 from GGD, which is just an amazing sounding plugin. I used Modern and Massive on the demo originally, but this came out about maybe 3 months ago, 4 months ago, and I'm really glad I picked this up because it just completely elevated the sound of the drums. I mean, this sounds 10 times more realistic than the old version of the plugin, and it just sounds great. And I kept things pretty stock. I mean, for all the kind of pieces of the kit, it's just the default things. Even the snare is this default snare. The only things I really changed were a couple of the cymbals. I kind of changed this crash here to a different one. I changed the China to a different one. I think I changed the hi-hat here as well. But nothing too crazy. I mean, it's a pretty stock to how the plugin would kind of come straight out of the box. And yeah, another cool thing about the plugin is they have a built-in mixer where you can, do all of the mixing for the drums. But I actually routed everything externally. You can kind of see the tracks on the left here. I kind of did all the mixing there. And I just prefer that just because I did that in the original Modern and Massive, which you had to do it that way in the original one. And this way you can also use kind of all the plugins that you'd normally use to mix with that, you've paid for and that sort of thing. So it's just a little more flexible, and you don't have to use the plugins that they give you within Modern and Massive. So it's a little more versatile. And yeah, pretty much the only other thing other than that is for the snare here, I did add a one shot. So I used 2 of the samples that they kind of give you, and it just adds a little bit of, I think it was a little bit more body to the snare. I felt like just the sample by itself, or the snare by itself, was kind of missing that. So this is what that sounds like. And if you listen to the whole snare, it kind of sounds like this. So if you mute it, I think it sounds a bit different. Yeah, so it's just adding a bit more thwack and I guess, body to the snare, which I kind of like the sound of for this song specifically. But I did something similar in every song on the single. So and that's pretty much it. The only other thing is, and this is also really nice in the plugin, is they give you a humanization parameter built straight into the plugin, so you don't have to mess with the MIDI at all that you program, which is what I do before in the past in Logic. And here you can just set the amount of humanization you want directly, which is really nice. So I did, yeah, just 5% for the velocity to kind of vary the velocities a little bit, and then for the timing, just like 6%. It's not really super noticeable in either, but I think it just adds just enough variation that it sounds a little bit more human and not super robotic, which is kind of nice. And I just made it global so it affects every piece of the kit, which I think is kind of the goal. That's pretty much it. We can take a quick look at the MIDI. I'd say when I'm writing, kind of in the demo phase and, you know, composing drum parts and that sort of thing, my default velocity is 115. That's just kind of when I'm writing, I'll program everything at 115, even though it sounds kind of bad. And, you know, basically then I'll go back once I've finalized all the drum parts, and then I'll kind of tweak the velocities like I did in the verse here. So, you know, in the intro, it's a lot more like there's the distorted guitars and that sort of thing, and there's a lot more intensity going on. But then the verse is like a lot more stripped down. So the kick goes from 115 to 105 velocity, just a bit quieter. The snare goes down to 96, which is quite a bit lower, just to kind of emulate what an actual human drummer would be doing. And then the hi-hats here are quite light, just around 78, just like a very light touch on the hi-hat. Again, just kind of emulating like what a human drummer would most likely be doing. And that's pretty much it. I mean, you know, I put a couple ghost notes in there around like, you know, much lower velocity as well. And then, yeah, pretty much just kind of manually programming all the drums. Yeah, when I'm writing, it is a lot of copy pasting. Like I'll usually finish out one repeat and then kind of copy paste it, and then go back and change up the fills and make it more dynamic and not just repetitive. But for the sake of speed when writing, I'll usually just kind of copy paste and then go back after the fact to change everything up. But yeah, so that's pretty much it for the MIDI. In terms of mixing, I've got everything organized into a couple buses for the most part. So I have a kick bus. There's an overall drum bus as well that everything, the whole kit is routed to. That's kind of what we were listening to before. I have a kick bus, a snare bus, a toms bus, and then the rest of the kit goes to these 4 tracks. So there's a cymbals track, the overheads, a room mono, which GGD gives you, which is nice, and a rooms track as well. So all the room mics go to that track. That's pretty much it. And then within these buses, there's a couple different tracks, just kind of the different mics for the kick and the snare and that sort of thing, and the individual toms and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think we can dive into how I mixed each of these. So starting off with the kick, yeah, pretty much everything's on the kick bus here. So there's nothing happening on the individual tracks. I just did all the processing here, and it's pretty straightforward. I just did an EQ with Pro Q3 from FabFilter. Got an EQ curve. I put some saturation on with Decapitator. Not super crazy, just a little bit of drive to kind of saturate it. And then some compression on the main track, and then parallel compression with Ascend here. Just kind of with a dedicated parallel compression auxiliary track that I used for things like the kick and the snare. And then I also used the same type of thing, just a separate track for vocals, which I'll dive into later. But yeah, I think we can start kind of with the EQ. I guess there's a couple moves I made here. They're not super crazy. I think the kind of main thing I'm looking at for an EQ, I think EQ and compression are going to be the most important things for a kick. But yeah, the first thing is just kind of filtering out the very sub frequencies, which really aren't contributing anything anyway to your mix. Just kind of filtering those out, just kind of unwanted noise. Then the big thing is just kind of cleaning up some of the boxiness that comes here in like kind of the lower mid range, or like the upper low end, I guess you could say. It's a pretty decently big cut. I mean, almost 7.5 dB, but that really cleans up quite a bit. And the other cuts are pretty similar, just cutting out. This is more like a cardboardy type of sound, and this was like a pretty boomy kick, I would say, from Modern and Massive. So there was a decent amount I had to cut out here, and then just kind of adding in a little bit of top end, a little bit of clickiness to the snare to kind of make it stand out a little bit more in the mix. But yeah, I think we can just quickly disable everything and see what it sounds like with and without the EQ. Yeah, so it's a lot more kind of uncontrolled sounding. It's a lot tighter once you kind of engage the EQ, so it cleans up a lot. And that's a big part of shaping the kick, is just kind of taking out the unwanted mud and that sort of thing, and then it sounds much better. With the saturation, it's a lot more subtle. Really, one of the things I focused on with this mix, which was a bit of a new thing for me, is kind of using saturation pretty much everywhere. And that the goal there was kind of to emulate analog gear, which kind of has almost built-in saturation just by its design, and it's a really pleasant sound. That's why a lot of old records sound really good. I pretty much threw Decapitator or some saturation plugin on everything, every piece of the kit, on the vocals, on not the guitars, because the guitars already have, you know, a ton of distortion, and are quite fine on their own, but for pretty much everything else in the mix, there's a good chance it has some kind of saturation on it. And it's not meant to be super obvious. It's not going to take it from being, you know, really clean to like super distorted or anything, but it just adds a little bit of that kind of saturation, introduces some kind of overtones that weren't there, and just kind of makes it sound more interesting. On its own, it's not a big difference, but when you sum that across every single track, every single part of your mix, the final result is going to sound a lot more interesting. And that was kind of the goal with this. So we can still listen to it though, but it'll be a pretty subtle difference here. So I'll start with it off. So it does increase the volume a little bit, but beyond that, it's not a massive difference. It's pretty subtle, and that was kind of the point, but that's on there. And then the compressor is going to be the big thing. So we definitely want to, I mean, with most pieces of the kit, especially the shells and the kick and that sort of thing, the main thing I'm trying to do is clamp down on the transients. So that's going to be the very first part of each hit, like the very initial part of the hit and the attack. We want to clamp down on that, since that's going to be the loudest part, kind of tame that volume wise. And then when we bring up the makeup gain, the sort of tail part of each hit is going to get louder, and it's going to sound much more fat overall, pretty much. And that's going to sound really good. It's going to make each part of the kit less pokey in the mix. It's going to make it, yeah, sit a lot better. It's just going to sound more pleasant. It's kind of a big part of pretty much almost any genre's drum sound, has this kind of thing going on to some extent. But yeah, we can listen to that real quick. Here's with the compression off. So it's a pretty big difference. And yeah, the settings are really just, 4-to-1 ratio, nothing too crazy. I kind of set the threshold just to get the right amount of gain reduction, which is, about 8 or 9 dBs here, which is, pretty substantial. Definitely, I'm not generally shying away from some pretty big reduction on the drums, but the kind of main settings really are going to be the attack and release. I mean, the attack is super fast, half a millisecond, just to clamp down on that transient pretty much immediately or as fast as possible. And then a pretty quick release, so that we're only grabbing that transient and then just letting go. So that's the main thing we're compressing. And then when we bring up the makeup gain, the tail of each hit is going to get brought up, and the kind of result is going to be each hit is a lot fatter and fuller sounding. And then pretty much continuing that, the parallel compression is doing pretty much the same thing. It's a lot more subtle, but it's just kind of one more step to get the kick and other parts of the kit sounding a lot richer and fuller. And kind of the whole point is you have this parallel compression, which sounds, absolutely slammed, like completely just compressed to a point where you wouldn't really normally do, but then you can kind of control how much of that is blended in with the send. And I did about, looks like, yeah, negative 20 on this send dB. So yeah, just like a little bit, and I can kind of engage it, disengage it, just so you can see what I mean. But it's not a massive difference. But here, I'll start with it off and then turn it back on. Yeah, so I mean, you can see it's here. It's pretty intense. It's going like negative 15 dB maybe, and it's a 12-to-1 ratio, super fast attack and release. Yeah, it's just pretty intense, but because it's kind of blended in there, it doesn't completely kind of squash and ruin the kick. It's still kind of reasonable, but just gives it a little bit more bite and aggression, which is kind of the whole point. And that's it for the kick, pretty much. Kind of the goal is just to make it sit really consistently in the mix, make it really present. I do think the kick has to probably be one of the loudest or most felt parts of the kit, and so definitely this kind of mixing that I did to make it super fat and consistent is a big part of that. So yeah, we can move on to the snare next. This one's slightly different just because I did a tiny bit of processing on some of the individual tracks. This is just actually a tip I picked up from Nolly, but he does a thing, or I've seen him do a thing where on the snare bottom, which is capturing the snares and the wires under the snare, he will sometimes take out some of this like 3 to 4 to 5K maybe, just kind of finding wherever it sort of sounds a bit harsh and take out a bit of those frequencies just to kind of, like it's kind of case by case basis. I think it's something I usually end up doing to some extent. I think here I did actually a decent amount, almost 4 dB of reduction. Usually it's maybe like 2 or 1 dB. It's like pretty subtle, but yeah, here I found myself doing a decent amount of reduction. So it's pretty subtle, but just taking out some of that kind of like an annoying frequency I was hearing there. And yeah, in the one shot, I thought there was just a little bit too much lower mid range getting built up with the kind of sample plus the one shot. So yeah, I just kind of felt like I wanted to take a little bit away, and then also just filter out some of these subs that really shouldn't be needed for a snare anyway. So that's kind of all that's happening on the individual tracks. And then kind of similar to the kick, pretty much everything is happening on the actual snare bus. So the first thing is actually a noise gate. You'll see this kind of a lot when you have actual drums that, there will be bleed from other parts of the kit, like the cymbals and that sort of thing on the snare mic, and you kind of want to gate those out. You don't really have that problem with GGD because you can kind of control all the levels of everything. So you can control how much everything shows up in your snare tracks, which you couldn't really do with a real kit. So it's actually a nice sort of thing to be able to control. But pretty much all that's happening with this is it's kind of tightening down on the tail of the snare. So it's basically making it a bit shorter, a bit less of like having a bit less of a tail, I guess, on the snare. Yeah. I think you'll see what I mean when I play it, but here, I'll start with it off and then engage it. So it just makes the snare a bit less ringy, which I think is nice. Kind of just tames that down a bit. And then, you don't have that unpleasant ring to the snare. And you can always kind of add that back later, which I did with reverb. So you always have that option. You can kind of introduce that back in, but I found the ringing to be a bit unpleasant. So I just kind of cut it out with this noise gate. Next up is the EQ. Again, similar to the kick, this is super important, but I kept it pretty simple. And these are usually kind of the two moves I'll do is, I got also filtering out the low frequencies that aren't really needed. And then here it's kind of cutting out the sort of mud of the snare, I'd say. So kind of moving around, seeing where it sounds best, but usually there's some kind of lower mid-range stuff that isn't kind of super critical to the like to the body and characteristic of the snare, and you can kind of pretty safely cut it out while still giving the snare or leaving a lot of punch to the snare. And then a bit higher here is a little more boxy, so I also just cut that out, and I think that cleans it up, makes the snare sound much more focused and just tight, which I think is great. And yeah, you can kind of, here, I'll show you what that sounds like as well. So it sounds a bit thinner, which in isolation might sound a bit worse to you potentially, but in the context of a mix, you definitely want to control the low end and how much of it is building up. So you're not really going to hear that in the snare when it's in the context of a mix, and it's just going to be clashing with things like the bass and the guitars, even the lower end of the guitars. So yeah, definitely just want to cut that out and kind of leave the punchiness of the snare intact, but without all that mud. So and then kind of similar to the kick, some saturation on here. I used a different style in Decapitator, different kind of emulation, but other than that, again, it's pretty subtle. I'm not going to really dive into that too much. And then compression is super key. So this is what takes the snare from sounding really pokey and kind of maybe cutting through the mix a little bit too much every time it gets hit, to sitting kind of right in the mix in a good spot, not really poking through and being annoying, but still being audible. And yeah, it also just makes it sound a lot fatter and bigger, which I think is awesome. So especially for this kind of genre. But here's what that sounds like before and after. Yeah, so similar to the kick, I mean, there's almost 10 dBs of reduction, and the settings are pretty similar. I mean, same ratio. The attack is very fast again. You know, the release is similar, but that's pretty much it in terms of the main things on the channel strip. The other two things, this bus or this send here is parallel compression as well, and then this is just some added reverb. So I put a pretty decently big reverb on, but it's not a super long tail, which I think is important. I think for a snare, especially when, you know, you've got snare hits happening pretty often, it's good to have a shorter reverb, but you can definitely make it quite dense, which I think is kind of the sound I went for here. And that's just using the stock Logic Space Designer. I use this snare plate preset. And then also just on that reverb track, I'm cutting out a lot of the low end, since, you know, like I said, for the snare, just trying to control that kind of low end buildup and limit it to things that really just need to be there, like the bass and the kick, and that's pretty much it. So just kind of cutting that out where it's not really needed. And yeah, here's what that sounds like. So yeah, just making the snare sound way bigger. I think putting some kind of reverb is definitely a great idea, depending on the genre, of course. But for this kind of genre with rock and metal, I think, yeah, definitely it's good to make the snare sound bigger with some reverb. That's pretty much it for the snare. I think we can just keep moving on to the toms. So this one is also a bit different because I did process each tom individually, but all I did was EQ. So the EQ curve actually looks really similar to the kick, and that's pretty much because a tom is kind of just like a kick that is getting hit with the stick instead of with a foot pedal. And if you look at it, it's not exactly identical, but the kind of main things are there. So, you know, just cutting out it's kind of the low frequencies that aren't really needed. I kind of do that for pretty much anything almost. And then cutting out a lot of this mud that's not really in the fundamental note, kind of leaving that mostly unaffected here around 100 hertz for this rack tom, and then cutting out a lot of the mud here. So that just kind of cleans up the tom a lot. And if you don't have that, I think it'll sound super boxy. And this is also kind of, this higher frequency I'm cutting is also kind of trying to take away a bit of that boxiness. But I'll show you a before and after here just so you can kind of see what I mean. So yeah, just cleaning it up a lot. It sounds, again, kind of thinner, and we're cutting out quite a bit of this frequency here, but in the context of a mix, it's going to make the toms just cut through a lot better and also not contribute to low end and kind of that muddiness in the lower mid range that we really want to avoid. So I did pretty much the same thing for every tom. It's just going to shift down a bit for the lower ones because they're a lower frequency, kind of as a fundamental note. But the same type of cuts. So this is the rack tom, and here's the floor tom. Looks very similar. This is all just done by ear. So I kind of will either put this up high or, put this up, boost like 12 dB or something. So I can really hear where that kind of muddiness is, or I'll just kind of move it around down here until I think it sounds best. So it's not really by like a formula or anything. It's entirely just by ear. And same thing for this one. I thought the muddiness and boxiness was actually a bit higher for that floor tom. And then for that second rack tom, I just thought it was around here for that boxiness. So yeah, always going by ear pretty much. I think that's the most important thing. And for the actual tom bus, it's pretty straightforward. It's mostly compression. I mean, there's some saturation on there again, just a little bit, same as everything else on the drums, just really subtle to kind of introduce a little bit of kind of overtones and that sort of thing. And then, yeah, I've got some just compression on all of the toms to kind of glue them together. This compressor does have a knee, so I set that to be just a hard knee, which is good for drums. 4-to-1 ratio, quick attack, quick release, and then, yeah, just kind of, again, clamping down those transients and gluing everything together for all the toms. So that's pretty much it. And then here, we've got the same snare reverb. Actually, it was really just the drum reverb, but it's the same reverb that was used on the snare just to make the tom sound a bit bigger as well, but a lot less reverb. This is pretty subtle. And then no parallel compression, even though I think the send is there, but I don't think I actually sent anything. So probably thought about doing parallel compression for the toms, but didn't end up doing it. So and then that's most of the way done. I mean, cymbals, I didn't even do anything. I just left this untouched. Overheads, I just did some really basic EQ, cutting out a lot of that low end. And then this is another trick I got from Nolly, but basically this is just kind of taking out some harshness from the cymbals, which I think, keeps that kind of shimmer and air of the cymbals, which is kind of, in the even higher frequencies, like 10K plus hertz. But taking out some of that harshness and, yeah, it just makes the cymbals sit a lot better in the mix without sounding super fatiguing when you listen to the entire song and that sort of thing. So I think that's a really nice trick to kind of pull out. And then room mono and the rooms are pretty similar. I mean, this is really basic, just cutting out some low end and the EQ. And then with rooms in general, I'm usually just kind of trying to slam them pretty much. I mean, definitely a good amount of compression. Pretty similar attack and release settings to everything else. The biggest thing that's going to be affected is the snare. And that's kind of what I was trying to compress the most. And you can kind of listen to that real quick. So I'll turn off the compression and turn it back on. So you can kind of hear how the snare sounds kind of flat without the compressor on. And then once the compressor actually gets engaged, the snare gets like totally squashed, which I think for a room sound, when you blend that with the close mic on the snare, will sound really good. It'll kind of fill out the snare and make it sound a lot bigger, which is great. And that's pretty much it, for the rooms. And yeah, I think that's it for the drums as well. And the only other thing is just the drum bus. I just put some really light compression on here, which you can kind of hear. This one's a lot more subtle. It's only about 2 dB of reduction. Pretty, much lower ratio, a bit of a slower attack. Still a relatively hard knee, but not completely. Just to kind of glue everything together a little bit. It's not meant to be, so intense. Like when you're compressing the whole kit, it can definitely go overboard pretty fast. So it's pretty subtle. And yeah, I think that just kind of ties everything and makes the kit sound super cohesive as a whole, which is nice. Just a quick sidebar here before we continue. If you have any music of yours that you're looking to get mixed and mastered, then I'd love to be the person that does that for you. So I put a link down in the description, which has more info about my approach to mixing and mastering and what you can expect out of the whole process. And if that sounds interesting to you, then feel free to check out that link below, and hopefully I'll hear from you soon. Yeah, I think with that, we can jump into the guitars. So yeah, I've got basically for everything, I've got the sort of hidden tracks, which are where I had my actual, tone, which I used neural DSP for pretty much everything. And then these are kind of the bounced audio tracks, which take basically just the tone. And then I did all the mixing on each track. So pretty much all I do for guitars, to be completely honest, is I'll usually just EQ and use Soothe, which is like a dynamic EQ, where you kind of specify a frequency range and it'll dynamically kind of cut down on harsh frequencies and that sort of thing, which is an absolute life-saving plugin. But yeah, pretty much what I'll do for most guitars is cutting out some low end, cutting out some high end, usually around 10 or 11K, cutting out the low end around 100 to 150 hertz usually. And then usually there's some muddiness in the lower mid range that I want to cut out. So usually around that 2 to 300 hertz range, I'll be cutting out, 3 to 4 dB usually to kind of keep that lower mid range a bit cleaner in the entire mix. And then pretty much the only other thing is just taking out any harsh frequencies, usually between like 3 to 5K hertz is where that kind of stuff tends to happen in my experience. And, I think with Soothe, it's actually a lot nicer because you don't have to fix everything with the EQ. So I'll usually just take out the kind of most offensive frequencies and let Soothe do the rest. And then for Soothe, really the big thing is just setting kind of the frequencies I actually want to target, which again is kind of that 3 to 5, 6K range. And then kind of varying the sharpness and selectivity a little bit, not going max on it usually, but kind of somewhere in the middle or leaning towards like 10s, but not all the way there. And then depth is really the big control. So just kind of how much processing is actually applied. I think this is the big thing. I try to keep it on the more subtle side just because I think if you put a bit too high of a depth, it can kind of almost neuter the sound a bit too much and it'll start sounding kind of weird. It's like you don't want to completely get rid of all the harshness. It's like the guitar character kind of lives in that as well. So you don't want to completely get rid of it, just kind of get rid of the most offensive stuff and then you can keep the rest. So this was like not a super high depth, but if you look at the rhythm guitars down here, I went a lot higher on it because it's distorted and there's a lot more kind of unpleasant frequencies going on with that. So this is a much higher amount of processing that's being done by Soothe. And yeah, the other thing to mention, I think is kind of interesting, is one nice thing you can do with Pro Q3 actually is you can process in mid-side mode. So instead of applying, a frequency reduction to the entire signal, you can split it up whether you just want to do the processing on the middle of the signal or the sides. And that's really nice for vocals actually, because my idea with this was to basically take out some of the frequencies that clash with the intelligibility of the vocal, which is kind of between 2 to 5K. That's kind of where, the human ear is really sensitive to speech and that sort of thing. So I don't want the guitar to be clashing with that. And originally, I was going to do this just when the vocals were actually in the song, so I wasn't going to do it in the intro, but I actually kind of just like the sound of it. And so I just left it on, pretty much no automation or anything. It's just kind of always doing that cut. And I'll just show you what that sounds like with and without it. And it's only affecting the middle of the signal, so the sides are kind of staying the same. This is actually a nice trick to make something sound a lot wider. If you have just something in the middle in stereo, you don't have it double tracked or anything, you can do a cut in the middle only, and that'll actually make the thing sound a lot wider. And I think that's also why this ambient guitar sounds pretty wide in the intro, is I think, partially to do with this EQ move right here. So I thought that was kind of cool. And we can just run through all the tones really quick. So for that kind of ambient lead sound, I used Archetype Petrucci, just kind of an ambient preset on the second amp. Yeah, just a little bit of, the overdrives there, just a little bit of crunch, just one mic. Yeah, just, all the kind of plugins engaged here. Just a nice like ambient lead sound. It's pretty big sounding. The other ambient sounds actually in the verses sounds like slightly different. Sounds like this. So that one's actually the Archetype Nolly. It's this preset I made called Big Vibe. Second amp, yeah, just kind of sounds pretty big. It's got the delay before the amp and the compressor, but the delay before the amp is what's really making it quite ambient sounding. Yeah, just one mic again, pretty straightforward, and yeah, both delay and reverb on there. And then that's pretty much the bulk of those are the kind of two lead sounds. There's a final chorus kind of overdub here, which I think is just doing the same thing. So yeah, also the Big Vibe preset. And the solo is a bit different. Obviously, this is like a more distorted sound. And here's what that sounds like. So pretty standard type of stuff. This is actually the original Archetype Nolly, not even the X. I think I just forgot to change it, but I guess it worked. It's just this preset called Hot Rod Lead that I made actually for my previous EP, the Invariant EP, was when I first made this preset, and I still love how it sounds. And yeah, I thought it just worked well. One mic, just some delay and reverb, pretty straightforward. I think it just sounds pretty good. And then a tone I really liked actually was this delay clean sound. So this actually is double tracked in the pre-chorus, but here's what it sounds like. Yeah, I just think that sounds really good. That's actually the Archetype Gojira. This was a preset from, I think, Joshua Della Victoria. Yeah. So this is his ambient crystal clean. And I think I just changed it a tiny bit. So it was like dotted eighths, or maybe it already came as a dotted eighth sound. I can't quite remember, but yeah, just really like that one. That's the first amp in Gojira. These are the kind of delay settings and everything. So yeah, I was a big fan of that sound. I think it just sounded really good and sounded kind of super thin, actually, which I think worked really well in this mix. And one thing that was kind of interesting is for this first pre-chorus, I actually double tracked that lead. And that's kind of because this is the only guitar actually in this part. The only other thing is the bass, but in the second pre-chorus, which starts kind of around here, it's actually still single tracked, but because we have the rhythm guitars come in to fill out the left and right ear, I thought it was fine to just leave it single tracked and also just kind of make it a bit more of like a variety thing, like make the mix a bit different in different sections. I think it worked well. I think, when you look at this EQ curve, I did something similar to kind of cut out some of that, or to clash a bit less with the vocal because it's in the middle there. And yeah, the only other thing pretty much is just the rhythm guitars. This, I did use the same tone for both the left and right guitar. It's Archetype Nolly. It's kind of, I think it's pretty much just Nolly's HBE style gain plugin. I might have changed a tiny little bit or something. It's just, this preset's just in the plugin. It's right here. HBE style gain. I might have changed something, but I thought it just sounded really good. And this was actually different in Thought Machine. For the other two songs on the single, I used completely different plugins, but also different tones for the left and right guitars, which I thought sounded good. I kind of remembered, I thought I did that here, but I actually didn't. So yeah, I thought this sounded pretty good. And, here's what that sounds like kind of in the pre-chorus section here. And that's with the processing. And it's a pretty big difference when we take off the EQ and soothe. Here's what that sounds like. Yeah, it just sounds a lot more like cleaned up once you put the EQ on it and soothe. So yeah, I'm really happy with that rhythm sound. I think it turned out really good. That's pretty much it for the guitars. Yeah, I did a little bit of automation here. You can see I kind of automated a bit of the volume. One thing I did actually is for this little dotted eighth sort of lead, I had this channel EQ that basically is just a filter. And actually that comes on for this one section, kind of leading into the chorus. Here's what that sounds like. And actually that gets bypassed later, so it'll sound kind of normal, but leading into the chorus, I had this engaged. I'll explain why in a sec. And with that off, it sounds more normal like this. So actually the reason I did that is I think this helps a lot with making the chorus really hit. And I can kind of play just the instrumental here, but this I think was a big reason, to me at least, the chorus feels really impactful once it kicks in. And here's what I mean. Here's what that sounds like. So it sounds huge when that chorus kicks in. And a big part of that is because that lead in into the chorus has so much taken away from before. So the bass drops out. Even the lead guitar here has, a lot of the lower frequencies filtered out. So it sounds, very thin. And same kind of with this other, this guitar isn't really adding a lot of bass or high end either. So basically the bass and the high end all come back in super suddenly when the chorus kicks in, which makes it sound huge. And I think that is I'm really happy with that. And it's kind of a good example of how the arrangement can really dictate your mix. It's hard to make a chorus sound huge and come in kind of with a bang if your arrangement doesn't really let that happen. So if I didn't have this little transition into the chorus, then the chorus probably wouldn't have hit quite as hard. And just real quick for the bass, this is a lot more straightforward. There's just one bass track. There's an EQ on it, just kind of cutting out some muddiness in the lower mid-range here, a little bit of mud there, adding a little bit of top end in the highs just to kind of make it, give it that sheen, to make it cut through a little bit better. And the tone was all from Parallax. So this is also Neural DSP. These are kind of the settings, just like a nice kind of pretty metal sounding bass. This is actual bass that I recorded, and here's what it sounds like. Oops, that was the whole instrumental bus. Here's what it sounds like. I actually only realized this the other day. This was supposed to be a multi-band compressor that was sidechained to the kick so that It could kind of duck the bass every time the kick hits, which is generally something you want to do just to keep your low end a bit more controlled. But I guess I actually just forgot to sidechain this. So this is really not doing a whole lot. Like this is just, it's just compressing the actual bass a little bit and not really doing anything. So that was kind of a blunder, but you know, I guess that happens sometimes. But other than that, yeah, it's just that and the EQ. The kind of the one other cool thing is just when the verse kicks in, I also threw on another kind of filter on the bass. So just cutting out a lot of the low end. And it almost makes the bass sound a little bit more like a guitar, which I think is kind of cool. It's like, works well in a verse where, you know, you don't need a ton of bass necessarily. It's a bit more chill. And then when the bass comes back in the next section, in the pre-chorus, it has a lot more weight to it, which is nice. But here's what that sounds like isolated, so you can see what I mean. Yeah, and then kind of all that low end is brought back in the pre-chorus here. So I thought that was a cool sound. That's something I haven't really done before, and that bass part is also being played just on, I think it was the high D and G strings. So that's partially why it kind of sounds like a guitar as well, as it is kind of in the same sort of octave as a guitar could be. So that's all kind of part of that. But that's pretty much it for the bass. So that was all just played on actual bass and pretty straightforward. All right, and the next thing is definitely the most complex part of this, which is the vocals. So if you kind of just look at it, I can actually hide some stuff here just to get that out of the way. But yeah, there's a lot going on. So I've got 3 main vocal tracks and then a lot of sort of supporting layers behind it, which I'll kind of dive into in a sec. But I think first off, I'll just talk a little bit about what my kind of process was for recording and getting the vocals ready to be mixed. So a big thing I made use of was track alternatives in Logic. This is kind of how you can enable it and have this sort of thing show up. But basically it lets you organize different, you know, completely separate regions and kind of audio files on the same track, which is really nice when it comes to organizing vocals. So basically I had the original takes track alternative, which is the original takes that I recorded. And then I would have a take folder and comp everything into the best take, you know, like that I thought was the best take and just get the best performance. And then I would pretty much take this, paste it to this other placeholder track, and then just flatten and merge into a single audio file. And then I would put that onto another track alternative for these exported comps. That's just kind of the final comp without any editing or anything. And then I would press Shift W to open up Melodyne. That's kind of something you can, I think, set up Shift W in your settings to open up an external file editor. And I just set that up to open Melodyne, which is a bit more convenient. And then this file would open up in Melodyne externally outside of Logic. I would kind of pitch correct it, do all the vocal editing in Melodyne, and then basically import it back into Logic and then put it on a third track alternative, which is the sort of final one that's tuned and timing corrected, which was all done in Melodyne. And so when I import it, it's gonna look like, you know, just a regular audio file like this one or something. But the next thing I would do is something called clip gaining. And so you basically just, in Logic, you can, if you command, you have your second sort of tool here. If you use the marquee tool and double click, you can just cut up a region like that. So that's basically what I go and do. And then on the left here, each region has a gain. And so basically what clip gaining is you go through and manually chop up the audio file, and basically you're kind of doing like manual automation or compression of the volume. So the goal here is, the final goal with the vocal is to get a really consistent vocal that's very present all the time in the mix, doesn't kind of come in and out sometimes, which can be fine for certain genres, but for rock, where it's always like very in your face. You definitely want a vocal that's very consistent and powerful all the time. And some of that happens with compression and, the vocal chain and the plugins you use, but actually a big part of it, which I, learned through making this song and mixing it, is clip gaining is actually a big part of that. So basically I just manually go through when there's no plugins. It's just the raw vocal take, with no effects or processing applied. I'm just kind of listening and trying to make it as consistent as possible. So certain words will be louder and that sort of thing. So I would bring down the gain as needed. You can kind of see every region here has like a different amount of gain reduction. Sometimes the gain gets increased depending on what's needed, but I think generally it's better to kind of turn down the gain when possible. And kind of the thing I'm aiming for is to get the level meter before all the effects to be around -12 at the peak to -10 maybe. I think that's a good sort of spot for the vocals to sit at. Ideally, you're kind of already hitting that when you're recording, but when I'm clip gaining, I want to try and make that as consistent as possible. So that's kind of a manual and tedious process, but I think it's super important to get that really polished vocal sound. And if we look at the vocal here, if we just solo it, you'll see it's generally going to be sitting around that -12 to -10 range. And this fire's left I've got so much more left to find, and it's yeah, so it's right around kind of that -12. That's kind of the sweet spot. And then once the clip gaining's done, then it's pretty much ready to actually be mixed. So you can see I clip gained only the main vocals, so the darker purple tracks, just because those are the main takes that are going to be the most audible. So I kind of did that just for those ones and to kind of keep my sanity intact and not spend hours editing all the vocals. But yeah, once that was done, then it was kind of time to do the actual vocal chain. So, starting off with Decapitator, same thing as with the drums, just a little bit of saturation. De-esser, so nothing too crazy. These are the settings I used. Getting about 10 dB of reduction on the T's and the S's. So, just what I felt was kind of needed. This is an LA2A compressor emulation from Analog Obsession. These are actually sort of by donation plugins, which are really nice, and I've actually been using them for a while. You can just download them from their Patreon, and you can support them through Patreon if you'd like. But yeah, this is a really nice plugin. This is used for, the actual LA2A has been used for like a lot of vocal productions, and it's pretty simple. Just a mix knob, gain, and how much reduction. That's pretty much it. Just kind of doing the initial leveling of the vocal, which shouldn't be too much after you've kind of clip gained everything already. Just kind of doing that first compression, a bit of soothe, just to kind of take out some honky frequencies, which is presets kind of doing. The EQ is actually cutting out. It's exclusively just taking out frequencies. So cutting everything below 140 hertz and then cutting out some of this low to kind of just the mid-range mud that kind of just is on the mic, and you don't really need that in the final mix. And then taking out just some frequencies I thought were a bit harsh in the higher end here. And then the last thing is just hitting the vocal with like an F or with a FET compressor. So this is kind of emulating I think it's an 1187 is what it's called. Also just a really classic vocal compressor, also from Analog Obsession. So this is just really more so about taming the peaks and the transients that kind of come through in the vocal after all the processing that's already been done. So it's not doing a whole lot. The first compressor is doing most of the leveling. This is just kind of the final polish and taming of the vocal in terms of volume and giving it that final sort of polish. So that's pretty much the entire vocal chain. And then I have quite a few sends going on here. So the first one is this kind of delay, and this is automated actually. So if you look at my automation I've done, this is that first send. I kind of just brought it in when I felt was appropriate. So something you'll see done a lot in vocal production is you'll put delays and sort of delay effects at the ends of phrases. So when there's a gap between one line and the next, for example, that's a good spot to put some delay to kind of fill the space that's just there. Kind of makes your mix sound more interesting and doesn't leave this kind of dead space in it, which can kind of sound a bit bad. So I did that. That's all just manual automation, what I thought sounded good. And then the other thing I automated was another delay, which is a bit more, it's sort of in other spots, but this other delay, which is just a half note delay. And that's actually kind of a pretty, like, I actually isolate it here, I think. So this is kind of what it sounds like just as the delay on its own. Yeah, so just kind of a one main repeat, I would say, and then when you kind of combine that with the actual vocal, this is what it sounds like. The main goal is just to fill in the gap between phrases. The static on the input line, the slot machine's breaking up. So you kind of hear it almost follows like an echo after the main vocal, and that was kind of the goal. And I kind of, the main thing here is just, a bit of decapitator to, this is a bit more extreme, actually putting some audible saturation and distortion on it. But really, Echo Boy is the actual delay itself. And that's just kind of the setting I put on it. And then Little Altar Boy from Sound Toys is kind of doing, I guess, making it a bit more interesting by changing the formant here. That just kind of makes it sound a bit more interesting and not just a direct copy of the main vocal, which can sound not quite as interesting, I guess. And then just some EQ, filtering out the frequencies that we don't need in that delay. And then, other than that, we have some parallel compression. So this is the exact same setting as for the drums. I just used a separate auxiliary track so I could send this to the vocal bus instead of, the instrumental bus. And the only other thing is just some reverb. So again, Space Designer from Logic, just didn't really automate this or anything, just had it on the whole time. Thought it sounded good. And that's pretty much it for the main vocal. So automation is definitely key. I think automating those delays added a level of, kind of professionalism and polish to the vocal, which I think it's important to kind of do that sort of work to make it sound good and not just slap a bunch of sends on and always leave them on. I think it's good to make the vocal a bit more dynamic by doing this kind of thing. So I think that was definitely kind of added a nice level of polish to the vocal, which was nice. I'll quickly run through all the other layers as well. So in terms of how I process these, it was kind of similar in the sense that, I had the original takes for everything. I don't know where those went actually, but all these had their original takes at some point, and then kind of, I wouldn't be as critical with, comping. Was generally just kind of picking one take I thought was pretty decent and going with that. And then instead of kind of pitch correcting in Melodyne, I would actually just pitch correct directly in Logic. So Logic has this thing called flex pitch, which is just pitch correction and timing correction. So I would just select all the notes, do 100% pitch correction, so it sounds super robotic, and then make it sound even more robotic by setting the vibrato down super low, like from 100% down to about 20, or even a bit lower. And then that makes it sound super robotic on its own, but when you combine it with the main vocal, I think it actually blends together a lot better. And then the other big thing is I would kind of go through all of these takes and basically just timing correct it so that each word starts and ends at the same time as closely as possible to the main vocal. So this way it sounds super tight together and, it's actually in time with each other, which is really important. It makes it sound super cohesive. And the other last sort of detail is just manually cutting out the breaths in each of these takes, just because, it's fine to leave the breaths in. I think it's kind of unnatural to take them out completely in every, in all your vocals. But so I left them in for the, for the main vocal takes. But when you have all these layers that are all doing breaths at the same time, it can kind of, be a bit much. And also all the breaths are slightly out of time and sound slightly different. So yeah, when you add it all up, it doesn't sound super great. So I would just manually cut out all the breaths on all these supporting tracks pretty much, which is why they're all kind of chopped up like this for the most part. And yeah, that was pretty much kind of the main sort of processing I would do. And here's what that kind of sounds like as well when you actually listen to it. It's going to sound super robotic, but then I'll play it together with the main vocal after.
Marked by unease inside, the static on the input line. This time machine's breaking up. This future vision comes undone.
Okay, so I'll play the main vocal just by itself, and then I'll add in the doubles so that you can kind of see how that's making a difference.
Marked by unease inside, the static on the input line. This time machine's breaking up. This future vision comes undone.
Yeah, so it's just making the main vocal sound way bigger. I mean, it's, the main vocal sitting in the middle, and then these doubles are just filling out the wider space, so the left and the right ear, panned all the way to the left and to the right. And basically what I did is for all the sections that were a bit more high energy or a bit more powerful, I would do double tracked doubles. So then I would, one panned hard left, one panned hard right, separate takes, kind of for the choruses and for the second pre-chorus. That's what I did. But for the verses and the lower parts where it's a bit, less intense, I just did one double that was down the middle, and pretty similar vocal chain, and all these layered vocals have a very similar vocal chain to the main vocal. But here what I did is, just because this is in the middle, this verse double, I cut out a big chunk of this kind of upper mid-range, just to get that effect of more width even when everything's kind of in the middle for the vocal. That's that kind of trick coming into play again. But yeah, so for the verses, it's, I think, not as important to have a super wide and massive sounding vocal, and you can't really get that when the vocal's super low and kind of low energy anyway. So I think this is just kind of giving it a bit more three-dimensional quality, I guess, and then really going all in on that when the kind of higher parts kick in for the vocal. And then kind of continuing that, harmonies are the last piece of the puzzle. So there's a lot of different ways you could do harmonies. I chose to not harmonize the entire section when I did add harmonies. Instead, it was more just harmonizing specific words or specific parts of a phrase. I think I'll just play it here so you can see what I mean, kind of what that sounds like.
And this fire's left I've got so much more left to find. And it's a foolish life on the inside, with no way to blind the uncertainty.
Yeah, I think this approach is just nice because you can emphasize certain words and it makes the harmonies feel a bit more fresh. I think a good rule of thumb is if you can listen to the vocals in isolation, like all the vocals in isolation, and it sounds interesting enough on its own, then that's probably a good sign that your vocal arrangement is good and interesting. I think just highlighting certain phrases with harmonies does that a lot better than just harmonizing the entire thing all the way through. And then pretty much what I did is I would have doubles for all the harmonies. So for this, harmony 2, these two are actually singing the same harmony. It's just, two separate takes. And then on the high falsetto note, I also added a second harmony. So you can kind of hear that here. At first, it's just one harmony, and then that second one comes in for just that one part.
More left to find. Food on the inside.
And yeah, notice, I mean, this is also sounding super robotic and also doesn't have any of the breaths or any kind of noise other than just the key actual, notes themselves. Like that's what we want from the harmony here. And I'm just cutting out all the other noise that's not really needed. And yeah, I pretty much was just harmonizing kind of the main parts of the melody, not the pickup notes, and those kind of notes aren't as impactful. So I was just focusing on the main notes in the vocal whenever I was doing harmonies. So yeah, it was pretty much just kind of by trial and error, I would say, figuring out where I thought it sounded good, what harmonies I thought sounded good, just kind of going about it that way. And then, yeah, you can see kind of in the chorus, there's probably the most harmonizing going on. There's this low octave that comes in as well. That's just an octave below the main melody. That just sounds like this.
Fires left my, I've got so much more left to find.
Yeah, it sounds kind of funny, but that's just another layer to kind of make the second chorus a bit more, give a bit more to the second chorus, basically, in the final chorus. And then there's this far away vocal. That's kind of a little detail. This one's just sounds far away because of the kind of EQ curve I put on it. It's just filtering out a lot of the frequencies. That's what this sounds like.
This future vision comes undone.
And there's also some reverb on there and delay and that sort of thing that kind of makes it sound far away. The last main thing is this sort of gang vocal thing in the core or in the outro. This is basically all the takes are singing the same thing, and it's just kind of meant to sound like a group that's singing in a room, like that kind of thing. Pretty much I had 2 takes here, left and right, that I was standing a lot closer to the mic for, and then these other 2 I would stand maybe like a meter away from the mic, so quite a bit further. And that kind of, the idea behind that was just to kind of have a sense of like actual space in the recording itself, not just from reverb and effects that get added after the fact. So here's what that sounds like all together.
It's a foolish life, such a foolish, foolish life, such a foolish.
Actually, you can hear there's a bit of distortion going on. I think that was a bit intentional with Decapitator here, just to kind of, kind of make it a bit crunchier, a bit interesting. Just like they're shouting, like it's a bit more shouty, which I kind of was kind of the vibe I was going for. I just thought that sounded good. Just a little EQ move there, and then just some compression to glue everything together. Which actually, speaking of, there is a vocal bus here as well, and then there's a pretty, kind of similar thing going on. Just a little bit of compression to kind of glue everything together. And here's what that looks like.
First, marked by our knees inside, the static on the input line.
It's about 3 to 4 dB of reduction. So, yeah, like a decent amount, but just kind of gluing everything together. And that also helps to make everything sound a lot more cohesive, I think, having everything glued together that way. And that is pretty much it for the vocals. The only other thing, this was actually something I picked up from a Spirit Box song, which I'm actually blanking on the name of or which one I got it from, but I heard them do the same thing actually. They have a song where it's similar to Thought Machine. There's a bit of a break right before the chorus kicks in, and the vocal starts just before the instrumental comes back. And basically there's just this little, really subtle whisper track under the main vocal. I think it just adds this nice texture to that one moment when it's just the vocal by itself for a second. I thought that was, I just kind of liked it. I just recorded this little whisper take, compressed it pretty aggressively, I think, so it sounds really just like squashed. And here's what that sounds like.
And this.
It's pretty intense sounding, but when you layer it with all the other vocals, here's what that sounds like.
And this fire's left my...
So it's pretty subtle, and I don't think you would necessarily even notice that it's there. But yeah, it just kind of adds a little bit of texture when the vocal's just by itself for a second there. I thought that was kind of a nice touch. Okay, and moving on to the last part of the mix here, just a couple of things I added as layers, and then also some of the production details as well, which are just a couple of things I sprinkled throughout the song. But really, the main thing is there's these two synths going on here in all the choruses. So, kind of similar to why you would do different tones for two different guitar takes. I use pretty much always two different synth sounds when I'm trying to double up on like a guitar part or just add some more layers. So this is just using Alchemy. I think these are both just presets and then kind of variations of the same preset. So they don't sound super different, but just enough variety to kind of make it interesting. And this is actually doubling up on the main melody, so the ambient guitar and the choruses in the intro. And here's what that sounds like. So yeah, no reverb, no nothing, just some EQ, cutting out a lot of the low end because we don't need it, even the lower mid range. A lot of this stuff really is just kind of a lot of like the higher frequencies is kind of what we want just to make sure it's still audible. But yeah, a lot of that lower information, we don't want these layers to kind of be cluttering up. So yeah, I pretty much just kind of had those, as MIDI programmed originally. And then kind of exported to or bounced down to audio later. And then the only other thing was just some keys. So the main thing is kind of here, it's pretty subtle. This is kind of in that transition into the chorus. I had the keys going here. So that's pretty subtle. And then they come back at the end or the second half of the solo. Following the melody in the solo, and then also kind of following the melody in the chorus for the final chorus as well. Whoops. So yeah, just to add another layer, and these are just presets from Logic, so some kind of grand piano-esque type of things. And yeah, pretty much the only other production detail is really the thing that's at the beginning of the song, and that's just kind of basically a reverse vocal swell. So I think what I did is I took one of the vocal parts, kind of printed everything down to audio, so with the reverb and all the effects kind of in the audio file, reversed it, which you can just do to a file like in Logic directly, and then added just here. There was nothing. I think this is just kind of a reverse swell by itself, which you can listen to. Oh, sorry, no, this is guitar reverb, and then the second one is a vocal swell, a reversed vocal reverb swell. So that's that one. And then I think this made it a little bit more interesting to bring in right before the song kind of kicks in, is the reverse vocal swell. So that's that kind of production detail. And then I just put a tremolo on it to kind of give it that movement and make it a bit more interesting as well, kind of in time with the music as well. And then there's just a little, this is really subtle, but there's just a little moment right before the solo that reverse vocal swell actually comes back. It's pretty subtle. I think you wouldn't even necessarily hear it, but if you kind of listen to the instrumental bus with the solo muted, you might hear it. So here's what that sounds like. It's just kind of a swell to lead into the next section, and kind of make that actual, like, once the bass and the rhythm guitars come back in, it hits a little bit harder because of that swell, even if you might not necessarily notice it. And then I just copied the same vocal swell, I believe, to the end here, just as kind of a transition into the next song. Actually, I just realized something I forgot to talk about was just kind of this little drum machine thing going on, which is kind of in the bridge. That's this thing here. Yeah, this is just something I programmed, the MIDI for. Just kind of like, yeah, like a kind of just a little beat I thought worked well there. And this is just a stock Logic sound, I'm pretty sure. If you just kind of look, yeah, it's an electronic drum kit, Atlanta. Didn't even EQ it or anything. This is just a stock EQ. I didn't even take out low end or anything. I think just because there's no bass or anything in the bridge, it's just that kind of one ambient guitar. I think it's fine for the drums to kind of take up all that space there. So anyway, I thought that was just kind of a little thing to make the bridge a bit more interesting, was to kind of have that drum machine part. And the very last thing we should talk about is just the mastering I did for this song. So I just did my own quote unquote mastering here. Basically, just some processing on the stereo, out track, just the final stereo bus. Basically, just putting a little bit of saturation, some tube saturation, tiny bit of compression. I mean, this is going to be pretty subtle, I think. Let's see what that's doing here. Yeah, about 2 dB of reduction, so nothing crazy, just something pretty subtle. Auto release, actually, which is a bit different, but I think works well for this kind of thing. A bit more saturation. This is a tip I got from Nolly, and this is like a top-down mixing type of approach where you kind of actually add this in pretty early on in the process. So when I was doing my demo and everything, I had this on the master bus, just kind of adding a little bit of top ends, like 2.5 dB, just a tiny bit of low end, and it just kind of adds that polish to the whole song, makes it a little more interesting, especially with that high end. It sounds a lot more like a finished product. And I think it's kind of, something that's done pretty often anyway in the mastering phase to kind of, assuming the song needs it. But I think for my mixes, it's something I do pretty much all the time. And the last thing is just the limiter. So yeah, it's the Pro L2 from FabFilter, just the loud general purpose limiting. It's not adding a ton of color, and just kind of going up to a gain I felt was appropriate for the genre. So pretty much kind of referencing other mixes from other artists and trying to get this sounding to a point where the volume is pretty comparable. And yeah, without the limiting, the mix is peaking, I think it was around -5 dB. -4 dB, yeah. So, it's important to have that headroom and not be already like clipping or something on your mix before you limit it. And then you kind of just add in that volume with the limiter at the end to get to the final sort of volume you want your song to be at. And that's pretty much it. And I just have a loudness meter at the end to kind of check where everything's at. But all right, and that's a wrap for the video. So yeah, I hope you found this useful. And if you still have any questions about how I did anything in the song, how I mixed anything or something like that, then feel free to leave a comment down below and I'll make sure to answer it. But if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.